looks like there might be breaking news right as the show goes live at exactly 7 o'clock. So that would make sense. Yep, just now reported Florida Gators Live 16. Florida is hiring Darren Wilson to coach the corners. We were expecting this a little bit. We didn't know if it was going to happen now or tomorrow or if it was like a guarantee thing. But the Gators will be hiring Darren Wilson to become the new corners coach, replacing Will Harris, who had just left. Tyler, what is your initial reaction to this?
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the names that we thought was pretty high on this list. I mean, it seems like a fine replacement. Comes in, was just hired as the defensive coordinator at Georgia State, but was previously spent the 2024 season as the defensive backs coach at Arkansas. So, brings SEC experience to the table, was good enough to get hired as a G5 coordinator. So seems like a solid move. This is the second, recently hired G5 coordinator that the Gators have plucked to kind of come be a position coach. Obviously in the case of Vinny Cincinnati, it was to be co-DC as well, but mostly focusing on being a position coach. So yeah, I mean, it seems like as solid a hire as you're going to make, especially a little bit later on here than you'd ideally like to be making staff moves.
Yeah, it seems like Darren Wilson is a guy who has been like moving up quick, kind of like how Vinny Sunseri is. I mean, look at Darren Wilson. He became the defensive coordinator for McNeese State in 2020 and that 2021 season. He then gets hired by Florida to be a quality control for the cornerbacks in Billy's first year. Right from there, he's hired as a secondary coach for the Arkansas Razorbacks. So that's a big jump right there, going from a quality control assistant to a defensive staffer for an SEC program. He then just got hired to become the defensive coordinator, as you mentioned, for Georgia State. I have a quote from Arkansas. After making an impact on the Arkansas secondary in his first season, Darren Wilson returns for his second season, working with the Razorback secondary. The Hog secondary was arguably the most improved unit on the team in 2023. I mean, that's some pretty good praises for him, talking about his unit arguably being the most improved. Had some All-American SEC All-Players like Dwight McGlothern, I'm pretty sure, who then went to LSU. Right? Am I getting that right?
Started at LSU
Started
and
LSU,
then went to Arkansas.
Okay. So flipped, but yeah. Again, getting players, turning them to all SEC level players, then they move up a little bit. So it seems like he's a guy that can develop and has improved rooms. I mean, that's some pretty high praise there, calling it the most improved unit for the Arkansas team.
Yeah, certainly, like you said, big jump going from quality control to a position coach in the SEC in one season. Also had pretty good success as the defensive coordinator at McNeese. So, yeah, I mean, makes sense. A guy that kind of is tied to Billy in multiple ways, in the sense that worked under him previously at Florida, and then also didn't coach under him at Louisiana, but they both coached in the state of Louisiana at the same time. So there was a little bit of, I'm sure Billy was aware of him from that too. So yeah, I mean, again, seems like a solid hire. I don't know that Arkansas's defensive backs were like the most incredible group in the country this year, but I think it's as solid as you could get. I think losing Will Harris was a bummer. I mean, I've seen people posting the PFF grades trying to like argue that maybe he wasn't the best, maybe. Yeah. I mean, we talked about, when we made a video about this earlier this week, like, Florida's defensive backs weren't like elite by the end of the season, but they were vastly improved from the last couple of seasons. So I think, Will Harris deserves credit for that. But, I think Darren Wilson has a pretty decent track record himself and is going to inherit a group with some talent to start off with, assuming that, these guys that just got here all stick around.
Yeah, it's another younger name that Billy is bringing onto this staff in Darren Wilson. I'm not sure of his age, but I mean, I just
played college football from like 2009 to 2012, so he can't be, much older than, 34, 35.
And that's like the same as Will Harris, right?
I think something like that, yeah.
So it's like they're surrounding Ron Roberts, the older guy in the room, the defensive coordinator, with a bunch of younger talent that maybe they hope can, develop a coach becoming a DC for us. Who knows how much longer Ron Roberts has on coaching in general, especially with Florida. So maybe they're trying to get someone who, they can hit on. They try to do it with, kind of did it with Patrick Toney. Got a bunch of experience around Patrick Toney. when you go look at like Sean Spencer, who was a very proven guy at Penn State, Corey Raymond from LSU, and Jay Bateman, who had also been like defensive coordinator at UNC. But Tony left after 1 year, so who knows how that would have worked out. Seemed like they tried to do it with Austin Armstrong. I guess Austin Armstrong is still a bit too soon. I think not fully ready to be a defensive coordinator in the SEC. So they got Robert. And now, maybe Darren Wilson is the guy that they end up having as the next DC when Roberts leaves. Who knows? It's just that's the pattern I'm seeing right now with this coaching staff and what Billy's likes to do.
Yeah, Billy has a clear archetype he likes. Like, you're definitely right about that. It's pretty obvious. Like, really, with the exception of Corey Raymond, obviously, and then maybe Jay Bateman, like you said, had been an ACC defensive coordinator. For the most part, these names that he's hired for these positions are not super well established guys that have been in the industry for a while. Like Gerald Chapman was an analyst, had only been in the SEC at least as a interim defensive line coach, just a year or two before he got to Florida, and then went to Tulane to be the defensive line coach. So these are all guys kind of on the come up earlier in their career. And, frankly, that's a gamble. And I think it's worked out in some regards and hasn't worked out in others. Obviously brought Tony along. That didn't exactly work out. He left. Austin Armstrong, like you said, that didn't exactly work out. So, that is kind of the concern here, but I do think, Darren Wilson coming in, having 2 years of SEC experience coaching the position is maybe separates him from some of those guys in that regard.
I will say, Will Harris did probably have a bit more, not SEC experience, but he had produced a lot of guys from Washington. So, from a proven standpoint, Darren Wilson's probably not as good of a hire as Will Harris was. As we knew, when you're getting Will Harris, maybe he wasn't the best recruiter, which he had been a pretty good recruiter here, so maybe he was. Darren Wilson, you don't know if he's going to have that development. But, I assume with a younger guy like Wilson, you're probably going to get a good recruiter, someone who's familiar with the area, McNeese in Louisiana, then with Florida, Arkansas, so he's pretty comfortable with the South. So I think that's a pretty big plus when you're adding a guy to the corner room. When Florida's a state that does produce a lot of defensive backs. There's a reason Florida and LSU used to be the DBUs until recently, when both teams have had a bunch of defensive slumps.
Yeah, 100%. But yeah, I think it kind of remains to be seen how good of a recruiter he is. I think, first of all, you're a little bit limited in recruiting at Arkansas. There's only so much you can do. You're in the SEC and at, a school that has fairly limited resources compared to the SEC, compared to some of the other teams in the SEC. But yeah, it worked out with Will Harris, from the recruiting angle, like you said. So yeah, I'm not necessarily blown away by this hire. It's not like he went and poached, the defensive backs coach for, some highly successful defense that was a CFP contender last year. But that's just not really again, aside from Corey Raymond, which did not work out for whatever reason, that hasn't really been Billy's MO. So I'm not really surprised to see this kind of hire here. Most of the names we had kind of heard associated with this were sort of similar guys. I think this is probably, of the names that I had heard for this position, probably at least one of the more intriguing names, though, in terms of being, a young guy, but promising and has had a decent amount of success early in his career.
Yeah, I'm not going to complain about the hire because it's way too soon. I will say there were other names around, like Doug Belk was someone that I had started hearing earlier this morning, which was a name that we both know Florida was targeting back when Billy first was hired here at UF. Billy obviously brought Patrick Toney instead with him from Louisiana, and Doug Belk went to Houston. It failed there, but how much is that on him? How much is on Houston now going from the American to the Big 12? Then went to USC, and they had a lot of defensive improvement this year, part of him. And he has 2 top 100 recruits committed to USC in the 2026 class. So I think Belk probably would have been the more splash hire than Darren Wilson would have been. But, it's also a guy who has a job at USC, and you're trying to get him for the same job. And, it's a pretty tough thing to do. So I'm going to wait and see with this hire. We'll see if we have any players end up moving in the portal, and we'll see how we can recruit. We saw Vinny Sensory come in. He's already getting guys, Braylon Womack, to now be at the top of their board. So maybe Wilson will have some connections with some guys from this 26 class from his time recruiting those guys at Arkansas. Do you have any final thoughts on the Darren Wilson hire?
No, I mean, I just think we need to wait and see. And like, I mean, just the fact of the matter is, like, even if you're, entirely believe in Billy and think that he's going to work it out and they're going to, continue to get right back on track this season. Like, the fact of the matter is, you're going to have a hard time poaching guys from big time jobs when there's uncertainty whether this coaching staff's going to remain in place beyond this season. Like, I think that's just kind of the fact of the matter. Not like things are looking great at USC either, but
Yeah.
I mean, I think, this is kind of, until Billy proves it a little bit more, I think this is kind of the caliber of candidate you're going to have to be looking at. But I think this is a pretty solid one. So, I mean, I don't have any like issues with the hire. It seems fine. I'm willing to see how it works out.
Yeah, I think what I was saying about trying to get that next guy up from Ron Roberts to develop, Doug Belk probably would have been that guy, having former Power 5 DC experience.
Yeah.